Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Jason. So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of International Education at the Education University of Hong Kong. So today I'm honored to chair Professor Meira Levinson's talk. And her work on civic education and educational ethics has been highly influential both in the United States and globally. So I don't think I need to make a long introduction here, but just for your information, I will just give you some highlights about Professor Levinson. Professor Meira Levinson is the Juliana W. and William Force Thompson Professor of Education and Society at Harvard University. She is a normative political philosopher who works at the intersection of educational ethics, civic education, youth empowerment, and racial justice. In doing so, she draws upon scholarship from multiple disciplines, as well as her 8 years of experience teaching middle school in Atlanta and Boston public schools. She is currently working to start a global field of educational ethics. She has written or co-edited 9 books, some of which have won the AERA Moral Development and Education Sake Outstanding Book Award, and other awards in political science, philosophy, social studies, and education. Professor Levinson shares educational ethics online resources on justice in schools, rich video materials to support higher education pedagogy and instructional moves, and resources for youth activists and teacher allies at Youth in Front. Each of these projects reflects her commitment to achieving productive cross-fertilization without loss of rigor among scholarship, policy, and practice. And personally, Professor Levinson has been very kind to me whenever I visited Harvard University. So I'm very excited to get the chance to host her in Hong Kong. And I have been following her work for more than 7 years for now. Her work has influenced my thinking and research, especially in terms of civic education and educational equity. I have also used the normative case studies that she developed on the website called Justice in Schools in my teaching. Therefore, I'm very excited to hear what she would say about this field. So in this talk, she will touch on a very timely and crucial topic, why we need a global field of educational ethics. So please join me to welcome Professor Meira Levinson.
Thank you so much. I can just go over, this clicker doesn't work?
It doesn't work.
No, okay. I'll just, well, all right, sure, I'll let you
You
sit
wanna-
there and see, but I might just end up wandering over and clicking. So thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here. And I apologize for the sort of quasi-bilingual nature of my slides. I've been in mainland China for the last 2.5 weeks, and so I had turned my slides bilingual for that trip, and I had not realized that the characters are different here, and that the simplified Chinese I should have replaced with more traditional Chinese. So if it's useful to you, great, and if not, I apologize. So I'm super excited to be here to talk about my sort of push for a global field of educational ethics, and we can go to the next slide. Great. And what I want to do actually is start by talking about 3 examples of ethical dilemmas in education policy and practice to get you thinking about educational ethics, which I realize is not a normal term yet, although I am hoping it will become one, and where you might think I have no idea what she's going to talk about. So let's start with this first example. So David is a student who's struggling academically. And in class, one of the ways that he tries to hide his academic struggles is by playing the class clown and being really disruptive. Because, of course, if he can stop the lesson from going forward, then he's never going to have to reveal that he can't do the work. And he is hoping to get the kids to like him from his joking around. And some of the kids really do find it very funny, and they appreciate the disruption to the lesson. Of course, other students find this extremely annoying and don't find it funny at all, and they just wish that he would be quiet or be forced to leave the room. So his teacher knows this. His teacher is aware that the reason that David is playing the class clown is in order to deflect attention from his own academic struggles, which might end up having him be mocked or bullied or excluded or just make him feel bad, and that he's doing this in order to make himself feel better and to stop the lesson from going forward. However, the fact that she knows this doesn't enable her to stop this from happening, right? He is still joking around, whatever. So there's this question: what should his teacher do? Now, there are lots of options in what she could do, right? She can kick him out of class. She can go and stand next to him with her hand on his shoulder and hope that that will keep him calm. She can partner him with Anna, who she knows that David has a crush on. And Anna is a really good student, and Anna's going to be really annoyed by having to work with David, but Anna's very good about going along with it, and Anna will help keep David quiet because David's really going to try to impress Anna. Anna won't learn very much, but it's all right. She's a pretty good student, right? There are lots of different things that the teacher could do. And many of these choices are pedagogical ones and classroom management ones, right? They're not all about ethics, but there are ethical questions that are embedded in this choice that David's teacher faces. Right? How much should she prioritize David's needs as against the needs of the other students, either as a whole class, right? If she put one of the things that I used to do when I was an 8th grade teacher and had a kid who was driving me crazy is I would take a blank sheet of paper, put it inside the envelope, seal the envelope, write the name of the school secretary on it, and I would say, "Oh, Rachel, can you please take this very important note to Mrs. Jones?" And so that would get Rachel out of the class, right, for a good 6 or 7 minutes, and she would get a chance to walk around and maybe chat with other people in the hall. It would give us 6 or 7 minutes of blissful calm while she was gone, and maybe she would be better when she got back, right? So there's certainly, there are lots of things you could do. In those 6 or 7 minutes, Rachel was not learning anything, right? The rest of the class was able to learn stuff. Now, it may be that Rachel also got some calming down and she would be in a better place to learn, but sometimes she just missed that part of the lesson, right? So that was a trade-off. That was about Rachel's interests, or in this story, David's interests, versus the interests of the other students in the class. There are also, I talked about how you could maybe pair David and Anna, right? And so now we're not sacrificing the whole class for David, but we are sacrificing Anna for David, right? So instead of losing David and getting the rest of the class learning, we're kind of losing Anna and getting the rest of the class learning plus David, perhaps, right? And so there may be good reasons to make these different choices under different circumstances. And of course, oftentimes you have more than just one David. Right? And we haven't said anything about the other kids in the class and what their needs might be, right? But at the very least, I want you to recognize there are ethical issues, matters of values, principles, ethical responsibilities that are embedded in this super normal, regular, everyday decision. Okay? Let's go to the next example. So, example 2. So Mrs. Taylor is teaching in a primary school that serves a lot of high needs children. And this school has recently gotten in a bunch of refugee children. If you are, say, outside of Hong Kong or China, you can think of these as being refugees from another country who might be fleeing war or something, right? Within, I don't know what happens here in Hong Kong, say within mainland China, you could think of these as being, say, climate refugees or refugees from a hurricane or an earthquake, right? So they might be internal migrants, but they've been traumatized, their schooling has been disrupted, and now they've shown up at Mrs. Taylor's school with a lot of needs and having had disrupted education. Now, the curriculum that Mrs. Taylor is required to teach is clearly inappropriate for these kids. It hasn't been designed to be sensitive to the trauma that they've gone through. through. It doesn't have much mental health support. It also doesn't take account of the fact that they've missed perhaps weeks or months of school. Also, as it happens, Mrs. Taylor thinks that this curriculum isn't particularly good for the rest of her students either. I said that she's teaching in a high-needs school. Many of these students do not have the kinds of support or background knowledge or academic preparation needed to succeed on the curriculum that Mrs. Taylor is expected to teach. She has a curriculum in her closet that she thinks will work really well for all the kids, the refugee kids and her regular kids, from a different system that she taught in. However, she knows that the assessment that they are going to be given at the end of the year is going to be high stakes for her and for her students, and of course is not going to be aligned with the curriculum that is in her closet. It is instead going to be aligned with the curriculum she is supposed to teach. What should she do? Again, there are questions here that are not only about ethics. There are questions about curriculum design, about the learning sciences, about education psychology, about child development, all sorts of things that you might think about psychometrics and assessment design, all sorts of things. But also, I hope that you see that there are real ethical questions that are embedded in this choice that Mrs. Taylor has to make. There are questions about equity, there are questions about responsibility, there are questions about potentially short and long-term goals, questions about the aims of education, questions about accountability. Who is Mrs. Taylor to decide on her own what the state has told her she should be teaching? Who is Mrs. Taylor to be teaching something that she is well aware is not going to be advancing the learning of her students, right? So hopefully you can see that there are lots of ethical issues, again, many values and principles that are also embedded in this question, okay? Let's move to example 3. All right, so Northside High School has for a long time had a really sort of the signature assignment of their 11th grade year is a 10-page research paper that students complete in their history and language class together. And in the history class, they're learning to research, they're learning about how to find primary sources in archives, they're talking about source analysis and citations and all sorts of things. And in the language department, they're working on the writing and the organization and all of that kind of stuff. Students find it very challenging. It's like the big thing that happens in the spring of 11th grade. And at the same time, everybody agrees, including the graduates of Northside, that it's one of the key assignments that has helped Northside students succeed in college. So in fact, it's sort of become a tradition for Northside alums to come back after their first or second year at university and say, oh my gosh, I didn't think I was going to get in, through that assignment. I hated it at the time, but wow, did it prepare me for college. I am so grateful that I did. This year, the teachers are noticing that a bunch of students are submitting drafts, first paragraphs, outlines written by ChatGPT or some other generative AI software. The principal sends a letter to all 11th grade families saying, this is a violation of academic integrity. If your child is discovered to be using ChatGPT or other generative AI software to complete any part of this assignment, they will fail this assignment. And of course, the 11th grade grades are also really important for university admission. Some parents immediately respond in anger, You can't tell who is using ChatGPT. There are all of these software programs that claim to be really great AI detectors, but they're lousy. They send off all sorts of false positives and false negatives. How dare you accuse our children of using ChatGPT, and you can't rely on this unreliable software. A parent who actually works in a generative AI company and who is quite well known and fairly powerful, writes a letter to the principal saying, what are you thinking? Isn't Northside supposed to be the school of the future? Aren't we supposed to be training our students to like be the best and the brightest in looking forward to the rest of the 21st century? Shouldn't we be teaching our children to make use of technology, not to fear it? But other parents are really glad that the principal has sent this letter. Some of them complain about the impact on their own students' grades and their class rankings when their students who have not used ChatGPT end up turning in outlines that get compared to the outlines that were generated by ChatGPT, and their students' outlines look worse. And they say, yes, it's a matter of equity that all of the students should not be using ChatGPT. And it's a matter of academic integrity. And then there are also parents who say, this is how students learn to think and research and write. You can't outsource that. And yes, they can use ChatGPT to complete it, but then they're not learning to think. So yes, absolutely, we need to stop the use of ChatGPT. How should the school respond? Again, you may see lots of issues in here that are not themselves ethical, but also I hope you see some ethical issues. And in fact, I'm going to invite you right now to turn to, say, 2 people, 3 people next to each other and talk either about this case or about one of the 2 previous cases if you would prefer. And I'm going to give you, say, 3 or 4 minutes to talk, and then I'm curious to hear what you guys think. All right? So you have 3 minutes. Talk with people near you about either this case or one of the other cases.
You want to sit here?
No.
Okay.
Would that be okay? Is that, I mean, to share with them afterwards?
To share on the website. That'll be
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah, okay.
The
Yeah,
comments.
because I mean, right now, I just got it from you just before this, so it's not on it. She doesn't know.
Before, so.
Oh,
probably-
maybe you ask her before I put it on the website. Yeah,
So-
but you have asked her that we will post the visa.
Yes.
And it's only the presentation, the Q&A will be.
Yes, okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay. Thank you for letting me listen in on some of your conversations. I started out listening to a fascinating conversation where the first person said, "Oh, I'm with the parents, you need to get rid of ChatGPT." And the other person said, no, there are parents also who are in favor of ChatGPT, remember? And then there was a back and forth about whether they were powerless parents who were against ChatGPT and powerful parents who were for ChatGPT, or possibly actually when I went to another conversation, there was a bit of a flipped view of the powerless parents being the ones who can't control their children and can't control their children's technology use. And then the powerful parents are the ones who could just tell their children, you may not do this. Which then sort of changed the idea of, so who has power in this situation? There was also, there's more than one group who was just hoping to do what I call sprinkle magic fairy dust on the dilemma and make it go away. And that was, well, we can find an app that could tell you what percentage was written by ChatGPT. And I said, these apps are actually pretty terrible. And then there was the answer, well, maybe we can just, the parents really can tell their children no computers and no phone use when you're doing this assignment. And I said, all right, so how are they supposed to do some of their research? So, we would like, I think, to be able to solve these through some way where there just stops being a dilemma, right? And sometimes there is a way that just it stops being a dilemma. Perhaps, say, the Northside teachers get together and they rethink the entire assignment and they figure out a way to teach their students how to think, how to research, how to write in a way that still makes use of generative AI. Maybe David's teacher keeps him after school for a few days, helps him catch up, makes him feel really special by making him a playground monitor, or the line leader for a field trip. And now he feels great and he's no longer disrupting, right? I'm not claiming that always what is a dilemma stays a dilemma. But I would emphasize that I think in education, we do face ethical dilemmas quite frequently. They don't all magically solve. And in fact, we can go to the next slide. Thank you, Jason. Right, I think these really are not exotic problems. They are everyday dilemmas. However, at least in the United States and in Europe, where I have most of my experience, and what I would say after my 2.5 weeks of traveling around China, I can say of the schools I visited in China, this also seems to be true, that educators and policymakers generally receive little support in thinking about these kinds of dilemmas as something other than technocratic challenges of classroom management, of leadership, data analysis, instruction, whatever, and they are not treated as ethical challenges of equity, merit, respect, inclusion, fairness, virtue, that is, as challenges that require educators and policymakers to think carefully about the values and principles at stake. And in fact, when we do talk about educational ethics and the ethical challenges that arise in education, I think that we tend to talk about them in up to 3 ways, each of which I don't think is very good. So if we go to the next slide, and I will say that when I use the word we here, what you should think of from now on is educators in North America and Europe, again, because that is the context that I know the most. So it may be that you will think, oh, this we doesn't include us because we actually got a lot of opportunities to think and talk about these issues, right? So first of all, I think that oftentimes we talk about educational ethics either as the top-down application of very general and abstract philosophical theory, and or in this form of thought, like thought experiments, armchair philosophy, like say the trolley problem. So what does Kant tell us about what David, what the teacher should do with David? Well, let's think about the trolley problem. And now let's think about that in terms of David, because he's 1 and the class is, say, another 36. So, shouldn't we pull the switch and have the trolley go run over David, right? I don't think that that's actually particularly helpful for people actually working in education or making real education policy. We just never, say to ourselves, oh, what would Confucius tell me about this? Am I a utilitarian or a deontologist or a virtue theorist as I'm thinking through this question about, say, what curriculum I should use? And like knowing how we would answer the trolley problem really does not tell us how we would respond to a real child in the classroom or to a school as part of a school district or whatever. So that is the first way that we tend to talk about educational ethics. The second way is taking the moral high ground. So especially in the United States, you will hear people say, I believe in educational equity. I believe in education for social justice, when they are putting forward a policy or a plan that we should extend standardized testing, or we should open schools or close schools or replace textbooks or whatever it is. And when they use those terms, I believe that zip code should not be destiny, meaning that a student's address and home should not determine their outcome. What they are actually suggesting is, and if you disagree with me about this policy, then you must believe in educational inequity. You must believe in education for social injustice. You must believe that a child's home should be their destiny. Well, that's clearly false, right? Nobody goes into education, practice, or policy really wanting kids' outcomes to be determined by the address that they're living in or the parents that they happened to have the good or the bad fortune to have as their parents, right? Nobody thinks that. But that is how taking the moral high ground and talking about educational ethics tends to happen, at least in the United States, is through these sort of moral pronouncements that then suggest if you disagree with me about a particular policy or practice, you must be immoral and unethical and unprincipled. The third way is through rules and regulations, right? And that is the most frequent way, I think, that we encounter ethical terminology in education. We're told, here's a code of ethics, and this is what you have to follow. And oftentimes, it's either super specific and kind of obvious, like don't steal the copy paper, and say, don't bully kids. Or it's so general, you should treat all children equitably and help all children, nurture and grow, that it's useless. Well, what does that mean when I am David's teacher? What does that mean when I'm a teacher at Northside High School? I believe in nurturing all children's growth and in treating them equitably, but does this mean that we decide that we're going to fail kids who we think use generative AI? Or are we not going to fail those kids, right? That these rules and regulations do not help me in these kinds of situations. We go to the next slide. And this is because ethical decisions are complicated, right? We don't just think about or apply one thing at a time. There are many elements and pieces at play, and there's usually not just one right answer. These are hard dilemmas which require balancing various and often conflicting values and priorities. So I'll tell you something I didn't tell you a few minutes ago. The group that was talking about the parents, I believe in the parents, and therefore I think we should ban ChatGPT, but there's this other set of parents, and these other set of parents, I believe in these other set of parents who are saying we should have ChatGPT. That was between two faculty members, right? So we have education faculty members who disagree in their response to this, and that's because these are hard, right? That there is not, I think, one right answer to these questions. And therefore, I think that we need a field of educational ethics that does at least these three things, that understands and takes seriously and responds to dilemmas of educational policy, practice, and leadership, that provides research-based tools for collective ethical deliberation among educators, educational leaders, policymakers, parents, and other stakeholders, and provides ethical guidance where appropriate, and support for ethical inquiry and judgment always. I think we need this, and we don't have it yet. At least, I'm pretty sure we don't have it anywhere, even if we have different ways here of talking about, say, ethics and morality and virtue in relationship to teaching. And let me give you a sort of second example of, I think, how having a field of educational ethics could have been helpful a couple of years ago and will be helpful in the future. So if we go, great. So during COVID, on the biomedical side and public health side and scientific side, there were lots of ethical decisions that were being made. Who should get scarce vaccines or protective equipment or access to ECMO machines or whatever? Under what conditions should apartment buildings or cities be shut down? Should people be forced to isolate or quarantine? Right, so there were all sorts of questions about rationing, about triage, about the control over other people. And when vaccines became available, there were questions, do you give the vaccines to those who are the oldest because they are the most likely to die if they get COVID? Do you give them to first responders, to those who are having to go to work every day because they are putting themselves at risk for all of us? Do you give them to people who might be immunocompromised, right? There are all sorts of questions about who should get these vaccines, when, and why. In all of those decisions, there were bioethicists who were part of those conversations. Again, I don't know what it was like here in Hong Kong or in China. But I know that in the US, there were bioethicists who were like publishing op-eds in the major newspapers all the time. They were parts of scientific commissions who would be part of the conversations as you had, say, public health researchers, epidemiologists, doctors, scientists, government officials talking about these questions. Bioethicists were there offering advice and saying, yes, these are the ways in which we see that this is an ethical issue. In schools during COVID, particularly outside of China especially, right? If you think about North, Central, and South America, if you think about some of Europe, much of Africa, right? Schools were India, schools were closed for a very long time. And when they reopen, they often reopen in a limited way. They only have a limited number of seats. So very similar kinds of questions arise as in the rationing of, say, vaccines or personal protective equipment or other things of who should get access to those limited seats. Should it be the kindergartners who are least at risk if they get infected and who are least able to learn online? Should it be the 11th and 12th graders who are most at risk of just dropping out of school, not going on to university, having their life chances just altered, kind of potentially for life, if they stay out of school for too long? Should it be the children of first responders? Again, because the first responders are putting their own lives on the line and because they really, really need childcare. Should it be children with special needs who need in-person speech therapy or physical therapy or occupational therapy? When these kinds of decisions were being made, and many, many, many other decisions, like what should be taught, how should grades be assigned, should students be held back, all sorts of decisions. There were educators who were meeting, policymakers, government officials, perhaps parents, but there were no educational ethicists there in the room saying, here are some of the ethical issues that we should be thinking about as well. People realized that these were ethical issues, but there weren't any educational ethicists in the way that there were bioethicists to offer their expertise as part of a collective trying to make decisions. COVID is not going to be the last time that we face these kinds of decisions about rationing, triage, prioritization, the aims of education, and so forth, right? As we think about climate change and its effects, including massive population movements, and the effects, say, on schools and districts and towns and cities that may end up becoming uninhabitable for times. As we think about political challenges that are going to change things, there's a whole bunch, a technological revolution, right, which gets us back to ChatGPT. It's not only about essay writing, right? It may be about the changing nature of work. It may be about totally changing social fabric and social structures, all sorts of things. There are lots and lots and lots of massive disruptions that are likely to come to education and through education. And when we face these kinds of disruptions, I think that just like the scientists and the public health officials and the doctors have bioethicists, in education, we deserve to have educational ethicists too. So that's my second case to you for why I think we need a field of educational ethics. Okay? So in this last part, what I want to do is just talk to you about what we've been doing to try to create this field. And this is not meant to be like an advertisement. It's hopefully going to be experienced by you, or like what I need it to be is as an invitation to you to get involved in this work and potentially to collaborate with us. Because this organization that I run at Harvard called edethics, that's what we're basically doing, is to try to create the field. So go on. So there are three ways that we're doing it, basically. One is through theory building and methodological innovation. A second is through empirical research. And a third is through resource creation and partnerships. And so if we go on. For theory building and methodological innovation, partly we're trying to do theory building about educational ethics. What kinds of questions does a field of educational ethics need to address? So one example that I've given you is I think that we need to address questions about rationing and triage. We never are willing to admit in education that we ration education or that we triage students or triage schools or even triage teachers. We're never willing to admit that we give up on some in order to serve others. But we do this all the time in various ways. And so one argument that we would make, I don't have a theory of how we should ration and triage, but one of the arguments is say that is a kind of question that we should be addressing in educational ethics that we don't address. We also try to do work within educational ethics. So for example, I, some years ago, was asked by the Boston Public Schools to help them analyze from an ethical perspective their new school assignment plan. And as I looked at it, I realized, okay, this school assignment plan actually continues to, I think, unjustly privilege already privileged families because of what schools they got access to. But arguably, they were doing that in order to keep those privileged families in the system, rather than having them move outside the system to better schools or to move to private school, which are better in Boston on average than the public schools. And so basically, the theory here was what I called the ethics of pandering. They were pandering to more privileged parents and giving them more privileges that these parents didn't deserve, but in order to keep them in the system and ideally grow the pie, basically increase the educational opportunities for everyone. So I ended up writing an article about the ethics of pandering. So that's an example of trying to do theory within educational ethics. And then we are trying to generate new kinds of work in educational ethics, and I'll talk about that actually in a minute, to give you one example. Next, we're doing a bunch of empirical research, in part to inform real-time policymaking. And so to go back to the COVID example, I will say that my husband is an infectious disease epidemiologist who was very involved in the COVID response, actually in the United States and around the world. And so he and I and a pediatrician in Scotland co-wrote a paper where they brought in the scientific and the modeling expertise, and I brought in the ethical expertise about reopening primary schools during the pandemic, where we said, look, this is what the data show about the risks to primary school children and to their families and caregivers. This is how we might think about the ethics of this. And we argued in favor of reopening primary schools much sooner than unfortunately they were in many cases, and engaging in other kinds of infection control measures that were not school closures. So that was an attempt to work together to bring empirical research together with ethical argumentation to try to influence policy. We also do empirical research to support our educational partners' ethical work. So for example, we work with a school district that had some beliefs about their teachers and like what their teachers' biases were and assumptions were and practices were. And we ended up doing surveys and interviews and focus groups and leading some case discussions. And then we analyzed both quantitative and qualitative data and were able to say back to the district, actually, this is what we see about your teachers. And so we think that these are the kinds of ethical questions they're thinking about and choices they're making. So that is a different strand of work. We also are interested in assessing the use and impact of our resources, and I'll talk about our resources that we develop in a second. And we're interested in understanding educators' ethical beliefs and decision-making processes. And I'm happy to talk, I'm not going to talk right now about how we do that, but if you have questions about that empirical research, I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. And then finally, we do a lot of resource creation. And as I said, we have partnerships with schools and with districts and with organizations. And we try to create these resources and have these partnerships in part to promote widespread teaching, learning, public engagement, and contextually grounded research in educational ethics, and also to strengthen educational stakeholders' capacities, educators, school leaders, school board members, parents, students, etc., their capacities to engage in ethical reflection and decision-making across lines of difference. And let me show you an example of that. So is what I call normative case studies, which Professor Lin referenced in his introduction. So as a reminder, I said that the reason that the three ways that we often talk about educational ethics doesn't work, rules and regulations, taking the moral high ground, and applying abstract theory, because ethical decisions are complicated. There are many elements and pieces at play, and these are hard dilemmas which require balancing various and often conflicting values and priorities. And as a result, the question is, okay, so how do we get people thinking about that and talking about these hard decisions in complex ways that gets them thinking about balancing these different values and principles? And so the way that we do this, one of the main ways we do this is through what I call normative case studies. Normative just means value laden. It's about values. And these are short but complex, empirically researched, usually narratives, often fictional. About 2/3 of our case studies are fictional, about 1/3 are nonfiction, written in ordinary language that almost always focus on a protagonist, a teacher, a teaching team, a school board, etc. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily one person, it might be a team, like in the third example, there the question was, what should the school do? Whoops, can you go back for a second? Focused on a protagonist who faces, again, a recognizable dilemma. These are not thought experiments like the trolley problem. And challenging ethical dilemmas. So this is not like you see a wallet in the taxi cab. Do you take the money out of it or do you return it, right? Neither of those. That's not a challenging ethical dilemma. It might be psychologically challenging, but it's not ethically challenging. So recognizable, challenging ethical dilemmas in education policy and practice. Okay, go on. And the cases can be read and reflected upon independently. Though we frequently lead facilitated discussions in a structured manner, and these are designed so that in discussion, multiple perspectives emerge as participants grapple with challenging real-world scenarios and choices. And hopefully, these are much shorter, obviously, than 5 pages, but hopefully at least some of your groups had a little experience of that, about how even having a fairly short case, but that represented different perspectives in it, could bring about these kinds of multiple perspectives. And then we try to encourage participants to engage in personal reflection and group discussion across differences. And we intentionally structure the discussion space to promote relations of democratic equality and to value the lived experiences of people present. So like if you have experience as a teacher, we invite that experience into the discussion. If you're a parent, we invite those insights into the discussion. We do not say, oh no, you can only draw on the resources in this case, because what we're trying to do is help create a culture of conversation about the hard ethical choices that we face in education. So just to finish up, I want to show you some of the resources that we have on offer. So again, Dr. Lin mentioned that we have a website, justiceinschools.org, where we have about 40 normative case studies right now that are freely available online that you can use. They are both in written form. Some of them are in also a reader's theater form where you can perform them. We also have a few in video form. There is one case on there from Hong Kong, actually, written by Dr. Liz Jackson. It's a fictional case that is, but based on research about parents actually making school decisions for their children. And we are hoping in the next couple of years to actually have a whole set of cases from mainland China as well. There are also cases available in these 4 books. The first 2 books on the right have been out for a few years now, and they have cases and then short commentaries by people from a variety of different backgrounds and perspectives. in them. So philosophers, political scientists, educators, students, activists, lawyers, a whole variety of people. The two books on the left, Civic Contestation in Global Education and Educational Equity in a Global Context, are actually both coming out this month. And those each have 8 cases in them. And following each of those cases is a conversation among usually 4 people, again, from different backgrounds. So that they provide a model for how you might talk through the case. Again, not giving you answers about the case, but modeling and how people from different backgrounds and perspectives might bring multiple viewpoints into thinking about the ethical issues that are involved. We also have a video podcast, so we have video versions of some of our cases and then also videoed conversations following them. We have 2 actually digital ethical simulations, which are like hour-long interactive, like deep dive experiences. And then we also, teach a course for people from around the world that's online for how you can write normative case studies yourself. Okay, very, very quickly. So in general, a small, like about 60% of our users come from the US, about 40% from outside. We think we have over about 1 million users of our cases. And as I said, we directly partner with schools and districts, and we work with scholars, including Dr. Lim, from over 20 countries. So these are just some examples of what educators say when they participate in our case discussions. It's valuable to dive into a case study and have discussions with colleagues that put us in the position of having a conversation that felt uncomfortable at times that we see as a good thing, and gave us the opportunity to listen to other perspectives. It felt as though we quickly became a community of learners and sustained this community through to the end of the session. It is so important, particularly in an institution as diverse as ours, to create room for discussion and for all voices and perspectives to be heard. As we all struggle with these ethical dilemmas together, we learn to clarify our own thinking and values. Those are real educator quotations and exactly what we're trying. I mean, of course, I picked those ones, although I think they're actually pretty representative. I mean, I can tell you they're actually pretty representative. I'm giving you fairly representative quotes because that is what we are aiming for. And this quotation is actually from a mentor teacher. So she's an experienced teacher who advises first, second, and third year teachers in her district. And we were really excited when she said, I now start every one-to-one meeting with exploring with the educator their own values. And it's shifted the conversation away from blame and or shame to introspection and desire for self-growth and affirmation, in part because the conversation become not about venting or logistical problems and all about how their values align or misalign with the expectations they have of themselves, their supervisor has of them, others have of them, and their expectations of others. So to end, I want to invite you, but no, there we go, good. We do run free monthly case discussions every month online, and we have participants from all over the world who join in these case discussions. They often take place in the evening Boston time, which is actually the morning Hong Kong time, so that's useful. And those are free, and you just need to find out when they will be, you do have to subscribe, and then we just send out an email. As I told you, we have over 4 free normative case studies online. And if you have, ways, you have cases to offer, if you have interest in following up, etc., I would invite you to email. And that's it.